All right, we're back and we're going to look at how you can track your expenses using this new PPP checking account that we created. Let's pretend we're going to enter an expense here. We'll enter a rent and a utility expense, and then I want to show you quickly a look at payroll. So let's start here. I already have created these expenses and I'm going to pull them up so you can look at it. So these two rows right here, the one that says expense to utility company ABC, and then we have ABC leasing company. Let's take a look at our utility bill. So this is a $150 expense for the month of May. And normally I would say utility bill or utility company up here is the payee, and in the payment account, your ACH defaults to checking because that's how you've set it up with your utility vendor. What I want to change, or if you were creating this expense for the first time, what I would suggest doing is instead of this regular checking, the main checking, you're going to select the sub-account that we created, PPP checking. Because utilities are eligible expenses under the PPP, you want to show that it's coming out of those loan proceeds. That's all that you need to do here. And again, if you were creating this expense, you would select PPP from the get-go. I was just trying to show you how it would look if, let's say, you entered an expense and are kind of going back and record keeping, cleaning up a little bit for the last few days since you received your loan. You could create the new checking account and you could change it to this sub-account. The other thing I want to point out and suggest, documentation is going to be so important when it comes to applying for loan forgiveness. And while there may still be things that are unknown, one thing that will definitely help you is to just over-document and attach things where you can, use descriptions, use memos, and QuickBooks is great at allowing you to sort and search by these descriptions and memos. So keep the naming methodology consistent. So let's say that you want everything with utilities and rent and payroll to be marked as PPP spending. Make sure you start either your memos or your descriptions with PPP. That way you can easily search and sort by the letter P and see all of those things in one place when you go to analyze your financials. So that's just a quick tip. Another thing that I want to point out here is the use of attachments. Down here on the bottom left, if you have not been using attachments for record keeping, it is so helpful and important. I imagine you're saving these things somewhere in the cloud or on your desktop, but it's important to not only have them backed up, it's important to put them here in QuickBooks for reference. What I would suggest is for any expense that you plan on asking for forgiveness for within the loan parameters, make sure you have your documentation readily available. And an easy way to have it is not only in your cloud saved somewhere, but also here in QuickBooks. So I'm going to say, put my May utilities bill, I'm attaching it here, and then save and close. And I'm going to go and do the same for my rent expense. So let's go into our ABC leasing company rent expense. And let's make sure that we're selecting that PPP checking account because rent is also an allowable expense. Make sure you have good proper memos and descriptions. And again, I'm going to pick an attachment and make sure that I put my rent statement or canceled checks, things like that. Whatever I have that could be helpful, make sure you're aware of the different documentation requirements and get them here into QuickBooks. So let's save and close. And then I want to show you a neat trick. So let's say that you have 100 expenses that are all eligible for loan forgiveness and you use your PPP loan money to pay for those expenses. When it comes time to showing documentation, in addition to gathering the payroll reports and 941 and all of those things that you'll need for payroll, you can go to this gear icon, under lists, go to attachments, and you'll see that all of your attachments will be right here for you. Then you can do batch action and export. And this literally will bring up a zip file of all of your PDFs, Word docs, whatever you've saved in here. So in 1-2 quick clicks, you can instantly have a zip file of all of the attachments that relate to your PPP expenses. So let's go back. You've seen how we did rent, we saw how we did utilities. Now let's go take a look at a payroll journal. So I'm actually going to search for this because I've already entered one as an example. But let's say you were creating a payroll journal and you use an external payroll processor, and now you're getting that entry into QuickBooks. Let's say payroll was on May 11th, and here is just a very general example of what your journal might look like. You might have gross wages, you might have your employee taxes payable, you might have your taxes that you're paying as an employer, a match perhaps, maybe 401k contributions that your employees are making. So when it all comes down to it, you have this net amount here that you're actually paying out of your business checking account to cover payroll and related costs. Normally, you would use your main checking account, but based on whatever is eligible for loan forgiveness or whatever you're going to use the PPP loan for related to payroll, instead of checking, let's call that PPP checking. Again, this is how you're going to be tracking what you're using those funds for. The other neat thing about this is if you would like to, or I should say, if you know for certain that some of these payroll expenses are not eligible for loan forgiveness, you could right now say, well, I know that $13,250 covers eligible expenses, and then I can go back and set my main checking for the non-eligible expenses, and I could put that in the description, non-eligible for PPP loan forgiveness. So when you're running reports and things like that, you can see how much of your payroll expenses related to eligible for loan forgiveness and how much did not. So let's save this. And now what I want to show you is if you go back to reports, we looked at the balance sheet when we created the accounts. I want to look at the balance sheet again to show you how the cash looks in PPP checking. So do you see here, PPP checking is continued to be spent down. It now says $35,100. And if we can click on that, you'll see the activity. So this is almost like a mini check register. So we started off with $50,000. We paid rent, we paid utilities, $13,000 in eligible payroll. We have $35,100 left. You could dig in even further if you want. Then you could click on this $13,250 of payroll and see what expenses made up that amount. The other thing you can do is take a look now just to see how things flow through. And let's go down and look at our liabilities. The PPP loan, even though we've been spending the money, we still have our full balance of $50,000. Why? Again, it hasn't been forgiven yet. So we're spending the money, but we still owe it in total. So I would expect this not to change. This should be the full $50,000 right now. The balance sheet does not show any income or expenses, so we need to go and run a profit and loss, a P&L, in order to see how the expenses are flowing through. So let's run a profit and loss real quick. This is run as of today. You can do a lot of custom filters and things up here if you'd like. But so what I want to show you is if you scroll down here to the expenses, you'll notice that these are some of the things I just put in. Employer 401 match, the taxes, I put in the gross wages of $15,000. These are all expenses that we incurred in the month of May. What you'll see here is it doesn't tell me in this P&L whether or not it was expenses from the PPP loan. Meaning it says that I paid $15,000 in gross wages, or I had a $15,000 expense, but was that PPP related? Was that not? So the reason that I'm suggesting and recommending not to use your expense accounts to denote whether it's something PPP related or not is because when you go to forecast, when you go to make projections, when you are doing budget analysis, it's not going to be very helpful to have your accounts separated out by PPP or not PPP when it comes to expenses. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If you're trying to project out how much utilities are going to be for 2021, and you run a report for utilities for 2020 in order to forecast, Will you remember to include a second account called PPP utilities? Maybe, but maybe not. What if you've been putting 8 weeks of utilities into a PPP utility expense account? Well, that's not very helpful then when you go to forecast, because it won't necessarily know to pull in that account. The other thing that's tricky is if you're going to go looking backward, historically speaking, into your financials, it's not very helpful, again, for year-over-year comparisons if you don't have all of your expenses in one bucket. So if we're going to look back and see, why was rent higher in 2021 than it was in 2020? Well, it's not apples to apples if we're comparing rent versus rent plus PPP rent. Why not just keep it simple? For small organizations, I think it's completely fine to have rent just stay as rent, and use the checking account sub-account feature to track the PPP spending instead of using expenses, and instead of changing the naming of your expenses on the chart of accounts. So I hope that you can see what the limitations are of this dummy account, but I also want you to see the advantages. So while we can't use that profit and loss statement to see our PPP spending, we can go down here under For My Accountant. There's another report. You can click Transaction Detail by Account. So if you click that and you scroll up to where these filters are, click on Customize, and you can set the date range. So I would set it from whenever you received your PPP funds, and you could run it 8 weeks out. Let's say you'd been recording it through July, whenever that date would be. And then you want to select under Filter, pick Distribution Account, and then go down there and find that new PPP checking account and click that. So what this is going to do is when we run this report, it will show us all of the transactions that have been coded or recorded to the PPP checking account. So this looks similar to when we ran the balance sheet and we clicked on the PPP checking account number. It's essentially the same report. It's just another way of running it and looking at it. So this is something that you're going to want to look at often so that you can see the balance in your PPP spending and you can see what you spent it on. And then what you'll end up being able to do is at the end of the day, you can export this report to Excel. You can go and click in here and get details. You can get the attachments from here, and you can create a nice file where you put together all of your rent, all of your utilities, all of your mortgage interest if you have it, or your payroll expenses. And then you can make sure that they match up with the needed attachments so that when you go to apply for loan forgiveness, you're ready. And the point of this all is to have really good record keeping. Like I said, there's not one right way to do it. Look at what works for your organization. This is just one suggestion, but I hope that you try it, see what you think. And from what I've tested and from other methods I've looked at and read about, this is one of my favorite ones for small businesses. So check this out.